Good morning, friends. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of PB Reads the Bible. In fact, it's episode 22. Good morning, friends. Hang on, I forgot to shut that off. There we go. Whew. Don't want those echoes. I just missed that. Grab a sip of water here while I'm thinking about it as well. Well, what is PB Reads the Bible, and who is PB? I'm PB, Pastor Brian, pastor here at Christ United Methodist Church in Waynesboro, PA. In case you don't know where that's at, it's right on the PA Maryland border. Mile south of us is Maryland, basically. It's that close. And I'm PB, I'm the pastor here. I love being the pastor here. And this is PB Reads the Bible. I do more than just read the Bible. This is our chance that we sit together. We join together in this way, small group, sharing life. We read from the Bible because hopefully you're reading along with me. At the very least, you're listening as I read and hearing it that way, because there's nothing wrong with just listening. Nothing wrong with just listening. In fact, what is it that Paul writes? Faith comes through hearing. Faith comes through hearing. So if you're listening, you're hearing, then that's how faith comes. That was what Paul says, admonishing and teaching us to speak about faith. Oh, excuse me, and about reading from the Bible and all that. So, but we do more than just read. I try to open it up, unpack it, so you can gain some additional understanding. I always use the word context because it really does come down to context. That means so much. Just clearing out a couple things here off my phone. Context means so much as you read the Bible. And many of you are able to join live 9 o'clock on the mornings when we do this, and others join other times, which is wonderful. In both cases, I ask you to just kind of say hi, or say good morning. Let me know that you're there, and also use that comment section for questions and comments, and to lift up prayer requests, anything you want us to keep you in prayer about, because we surround each other with prayer. We're a small group where we share life together. I see got a couple of folks here that have signed in, so to speak, or checking in. Romper room roll call. Good morning, Cheryl. Good to have you joining us, and good morning to you, Shar. Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm sure more will be joining us soon. I did get a notification this morning. Looks like it came up pretty quickly. Hopefully you got them too. If you're signed up for notifications. If not, then I do recommend that. That way, anytime we do a live video, you'll be notified right away that, hey, something's going on. You, of course, can also sign up for notifications anytime we post anything on Facebook. Any announcements and pictures or anything like that as well. Good cloudy morning to be together, Maureen says. It is indeed a good morning to be together, and yes, it is a little cloudy out there. We got some rain, but we still need more. We still need more. So we're gonna keep praying for rain and keep carrying our umbrellas when we pray. So let's see here. Announcements. So today is Tuesday. Today is Tuesday, August 23rd, and it is episode 22 on our journey through 2nd Samuel, or the second half of Samuel. And it's going to be our last episode. We're going to finish up 2nd Samuel today as we look at chapter 24. Now, I did to do some looking. I think I know what we're going to be doing next. We're going to turn to the New Testament. I like going kind of back and forth between Old and New. I don't want to just do Old Testament, but I also don't want to just do New Testament. Sometimes as Christians, we tend to concentrate on the New Testament. Pastors, priests tend to preach only from the New Testament sometimes, and the RCL, the Revised Common Lectionary, and materials related to it tend to push us towards reading and preaching from the gospel and from the New Testament. But it's important to remember that the whole Bible is canon for us, and it's important to read from the Old Testament as well as the New. Francis Asbury, one of the founders, we might say, one of the original of American Methodism, of the American Methodist Church, admonished his preachers to preach from the Old Testament and to read from the Old Testament. And he said to read at least for every Sunday. This would be for every worship service, read. If you're not going to preach from it, read at least one chapter from the Old Testament each week during worship, in addition to whatever you're going to be preaching from. So it's important to remember that the Old Testament is just as important to read. It's part of our faith. It's part of our faith, and we see the whole story. But so I like to bounce around and go back and forth, and maybe do a couple from the Old Testament and one or two from the New. So next up, we're going to go to the New Testament. I think we're going to go to 1 Corinthians. We'll touch base with 1 Corinthians next, a letter from Paul. We did Paul's letter to the Romans a couple months ago. That was a good one. That was a good one. That was a long one, because not that the book is all that long, but because those chapters, most of those chapters, we had to read in pieces because there was just so much there to talk about. 1 Corinthians probably isn't going to be quite as heavy and deep as Romans was, but there will be a significant amount of unpacking to do with that as well. Now, when are we going to start it? Because I looked at the calendar, and I'm taking a week's vacation in August, the middle of the month, from the 12th through the 18th. I'm taking off. So rather than kind of doing a start and stop on this, we're going to take a little extended break, I guess you would say. We're going to take a couple weeks off here, and we're going to start with 1 Corinthians on Monday, September 19th. Okay, that's when we will restart. That's when we'll restart PB Reads, and it'll be episode 1 of, most likely anyway, 1 Corinthians. Okay, so September 19th. So we're taking a couple weeks off. Good morning, Pat. Wonderful morning there with 61 degrees. Good. Enjoy the day, people. Enjoy the day. Regardless of what the weather is like outside, enjoy the day. Enjoy the day. All right. So yes, today wraps up 2 Samuel. We're not going to have anything the rest of this week. Then we're going to take a couple weeks off because, like I said, don't want to start and stop. Because I also have a couple of days there when I couldn't do something because I've got early morning meetings. And we will restart this. We'll restart PB Reads the Bible on Monday, September 19th, most likely looking at 1 Corinthians. I say most likely because you never know. I might change my mind between now and then, but that's most likely what it's going to be. Sunday, of course, is worship. And we have in-person worship at 8:15, 10:45. Love to have folks join us if you're in the area, if you're in the neighborhood. And if you're not in the neighborhood, or you can't be here for some reason, or you're sick and you want to stay home, we get that. We actually appreciate if you're sick, just stay home. You can still join in worship with us wherever you are, at the 10:45 via live stream, Facebook, YouTube, and the website, because that is live streamed. That one is. Let me just check one thing here. I think I know what that was. And I think that's about the only announcement. We finished our series on the Exodus in the wilderness. We don't really have a series coming up for the next few weeks, at least. I think we're going to be spending September and probably October, maybe even November, visiting the lectionary. I see us spending a lot of time in the gospel, which is mostly the Gospel of Luke this year. It's mostly the Gospel of Luke. I think there's at least 1 week when it's Mark. But so we're going to be spending time in Luke by the look of it as we go through worship for the next couple months. And then, of course, the end of November begins Advent, and then that's our series, The Redemption of Scrooge. God bless us, everyone. The Redemption of Scrooge, which I think you're going to love. I really do think you're going to love. I think it's a very impactful series as we look at the story of Christmas Carol through the eyes of faith and through the eyes of Christianity, and unpack some of the Christian themes, the theme of grace that is so that imbues that story. Good morning, Colleen. Yes, good morning. Good morning. Glad you're able to join us this morning. Good morning, John. Great to have you here. Great to have you here. All right. So let's get to the story then, shall we? Chapter 24, the final chapter of 2 Samuel. Final chapter of 2 Samuel. And again, just to repeat from yesterday, the last 3 chapters are considered to be appendices. So just because this is the last chapter of the book doesn't mean it takes place at the end of David's life. The story that is related in here, other scholars, many scholars say, probably took place earlier in David's life and reign. They've even gone so far. Excuse me. Most of them agree that it took place earlier in David's reign. Some try to identify a time or try to fit it, say that it belongs, between chapters, whatever, earlier in the book of 2 Samuel. There's not enough evidence for any of that. So we're just going to leave it as it is, is how it is, because its placement is kind of important. That tells part of it. Some of what takes place here brackets what took place in the very early chapters of 1 Samuel. Okay, so it kind of bookends the 2 books, which of course were just 1 book. All right, but let's read. Again, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go count the people of Israel and Judah." Pause. We're going to pause right off the bat. I'm probably going to pause a couple times here near the beginning. The author doesn't give us details as to why Yahweh's anger was kindled against Israel. We're not told why. We're not told what happened. Excuse me. It is marked with again because Israel has done it before to Yahweh, upset God for whatever reason. We're not told why. We're not told why. But it says that God incited David to go count the people of Israel and Judah, to perform a census. Now, okay. This story also appears in the Chronicles, and it's 1 Chronicles 21. 1 Chronicles 21 retells this story. But 1 Chronicles is from a later time period. This is the earlier version of the story. The chronicler, who would have been, we believe, post-exile, when they wrote that down, would have been influenced by the theology of Babylon and other places, and was disturbed apparently by these words here, saying that God is the one that incited David to sin, because what he's asking David to do, we're going to find out, is a sin, although we don't know why. We don't know fully why. Okay, we have some thoughts on that, and we'll get there. But what God is asking David to do is seen as a sin. And the author of Chronicles was disturbed at the idea of God inciting someone to sin. And so the chronicler changes it and says that it was the adversary. The adversary, which in Hebrew is Satan, from which we get Satan. We think of Satan. So the chronicler is changes the story because he didn't like the idea of God being the one asking someone to commit a sin. That is one of the only 2 times in scripture that Satan is mentioned, that Satan is mentioned. That one verse in Chronicles, and also in the story of Job. I mean, just at the very beginning and the very ending of Job, we see the adversary. Satan isn't big in the Old Testament because for much of the Old Testament, the theology and belief of Satan, especially with the idea that it's come to be, as far as Satan being this evil tempter and stuff like that, doesn't take place yet. When most of these books were written, that theology begins to make an inroad into Judaism following the exile, perhaps during the exile. There seems to have been a big influence by Zoroastrianism to influence that thought. And so the author of Chronicles does do that, changes it and puts Satan into the story. This is the older version, and that's not here. Okay, so if you're familiar with the other one, don't be thinking about the other one right now, although I just made you think about it, I'm sure. All right, but it says that God incited David against them, saying, go count the people of Israel and Judah, go perform a census. Picking up from there. So the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army who were with him, go through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and take a census of the people so that I may know how many there are. But Joab said to the king, may Yahweh your God increase the number of the people 100-fold, while the eyes of my lord the king can still see it. But why does my lord the king want to do this? Pause. Joab is reluctant to perform this census. What is it about this census that's disturbing? Why is it seen as such a bad thing? Now, Joab uses some very deferential language and, heaping praise upon David. Oh, may God bless you and give you even more and more people to reign over. But why do you want to do this? Why do you want to count them? And it wasn't just Joab, apparently, it was also the commanders, because we read here, verse 4, but the king's word prevailed against Joab and the commanders of the army. Pause. So David, a royal fiat said, you're going to do it. Just do it. Picking up. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to take a census of the people of Israel. Pause. Why did the leaders of the army, and presumably their soldiers with them, why were they needed to perform this census? It almost sounds like they're going to be needing to use military strength and power to count the people. This is a big change for Israel. Rather than, each tribe having their own thing, David wants it. This seems to be one part of really consolidating the kingdom and the administration. Why do I say that? We're going to find out. Picking up, they crossed the Jordan and began from Aroer and from the city that is in the middle of the valley toward Gad and onto Jazer. Then they came to Gilead and to Kadesh in the land of the Hittites, and they came to Dan. And from Dan they went around to Sidon and came to the fortress of Tyre and to all the cities of the Hivites and Canaanites. And they went out to the Negeb of Judah at Beersheba. So when they had gone through all the land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Pause. So the names of some of these places, these place names, would indicate like the far reaches of the kingdom. And it includes the words Dan and Beersheba, which from Dan to Beersheba was kind of a way of saying, like from A to Z. It's the entire country from Dan to Beersheba. But they're even being specific with some of these place names because they're the far-flung outer reaches. And David's soldiers, Joab and the commanders, presumably with the military backing behind them, went through all this land, and it took over 9 months, 9 months and 20 days. Even if we don't read those numbers literally, we can say that the author is saying that it took a long time to count all these people. But now we're going to find out at least a hint as to why doing this census was a sin, was a bad thing. Joab reported to the king the number of those who had been recorded. In Israel, there were 800,000 soldiers able to draw the sword, and those of Judah were 500,000. Pause. The census wasn't really for all the people. It was to count those who were of military service. It seems like, as I said, David is consolidating administration, but also consolidating power. This seems to be a preview, the beginning of a conscription into military service. David wanted to know how many military age people, how many men are out there who can carry a sword, who can serve in the army, whom I can conscript into military service. It might also be that this is going to be the beginnings of some heavy taxation based on the number of people. But since they're so specific about military might and the ability to carry a sword, it seems to be indicating some form of conscription. The census will also be used by Solomon, not only for conscripting into the military, but conscripting into forced labor, taking people for forced labor for his building projects. Okay, so we might say that some of the sin here is that it's going to be taking away people's individual rights, we might say, and their ability to choose, but instead being used by the king, being taken by the king. We remember those words from Samuel. David seems to be, with this story here, with this part here, seems to be living up to the warning from Samuel about a king taking from the people whatever the king wanted. And in this case, it was people for military service and for forced labor. Okay, picking up from there. But afterward, David was stricken to the heart because he had numbered the people. Pause. So we're not told how or why, but for some reason, David comes to the realization that what he had done was wrong, that this was a sin. We're not told. Did the prophet come and speak to him? Did God speak to him directly? Remember, David is claimed, or it's been claimed to David. It's been claimed that David has these prophetic abilities that he speaks with and for God. So we're not told how he came to the realization, but somehow he came to realize that what he had done was wrong. Picking up, David said to Yahweh, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Yahweh, I pray you take away the guilt of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. When David rose in the morning, the word of Yahweh came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say to David, thus says Yahweh, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, and I will do it to you. Pause. This is odd, but the author says that God is giving David the choice of what the consequences of his sin, of his actions will be. Picking up. So Gad came to David and told him, he asked him, shall 3 years of famine come to you on your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to the one who sent me. Pause. So we notice that the three choices and have descending amounts of time. One is 3 years of famine. Okay, actually, that's how it's translated in Greek in the Septuagint. In some of the original Hebrew documents, it's 7 years, which would be that complete amount of years, a complete amount of years. But someone apparently changed it to 3 because the others are all 3. Whatever. So 3 years of famine, 3 months of war, or 3 days of pestilence. 3 days of pestilence. This is the first case that I'm aware of, the first time, that I'm aware of, I should say. Make sure I say that correctly. First time that I'm aware of the use of those 3: famine, pestilence, and sword. Famine, pestilence, and war, whatever way you want to say it. And yes, in different order. But those 3 become very symbolic and apocryphal for God's judgment. We see it numerous times by the prophets. When you get into the prophets, it appears there a number of times throughout the Old Testament. We also, of course, see that in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, which has that origin in Jewish apocalyptic literature. So in the various apocalyptic literatures and the prophets, they use those 3 things a lot: famine, pestilence, sword, in some order or another. Here, of course, it's famine, sword, or pestilence are the 3 options you have. Pick one. Now consider and decide. All right. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of Yahweh, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into human hands. Pause. So reading that closely, we actually see that David has chosen one that he does not want, because he says, let me not fall into human hands. So that takes away the 3 months of war. That takes away the 3 months of war, leaving famine, 3 years of famine, or 3 days of pestilence. But David is leaving it up to God, and notice his words: for his mercy is great. David is trusting in God's mercy. David did wrong, apparently, right? We're not fully understanding what the sin is. We have some thoughts and ideas, which I've expressed. But David has acknowledged that sin, and we would presume is repenting or going to repent. But he's acknowledged the sin and confessed the sin, and God has pronounced that there's going to be consequences. But David still believes in and still has faith in God's mercy. So he's going to leave it up to God to decide what the consequence or punishment will be for his sin. So what's going to happen next? Is God going to give David 3 years of famine across the whole land, or 3 days of pestilence? So Yahweh sent a pestilence on Israel from that morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 of the people died, from Dan to Beersheba. Pause. There we go. From Dan to Beersheba. So across the whole of Israel, 70,000 people died. Now God sent a pestilence from that morning until the appointed time. But when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, Yahweh relented concerning the evil and said to the angel who was bringing destruction upon the people, "It is enough. Now stay your hand." The angel of Yahweh was then by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Pause. So although the author says in verse 15 that God sent the pestilence from that morning until the appointed time, it doesn't sound like the full 3 days has passed, because the angel was still there, was still ready with sword, and was reaching out towards Jerusalem with pestilence, but God stopped the angel. So it sounds like God didn't give them the full 3 days of pestilence, didn't allow the full 3 days of pestilence, but that God stopped it sometime before the full 3 days had passed. You notice, you get what I'm saying? It does say that God sent it from that morning until the appointed time, which could mean the 3 days, but that also could mean something else. But while the angel was still stretching out his or her hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, God said, "That's enough. That's enough." Now, if it was the full 3 days, God wouldn't have had to say, "That's enough," because the angel would have known that's enough and would have stopped. The angel of Yahweh was then by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Does the angel stay there? We don't know. In Chronicles telling of this story, the angel is still there, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. All right, and it's at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. I think earlier translations, other translations might say Oran or something like that, or Oran the Jebusite. NIV and NRSV say Araunah, Arauna, the Jebusite, which of course written down in Hebrew would have just in the Old Testament, in the Masoretic texts, would have just been the letters RN. There were no vowels written down. That would explain the differences of opinion if it was Oran or Arana, because all those extra letters are just vowels. Picking up from there, when David saw the angel who was destroying the people, he said to Yahweh, "I alone have sinned, and I alone have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house." So actually it was wrong. According to the author, the angel is still there now. I think that's the last time the angel is mentioned on this one. So David has trusted in God's mercy, and apparently, I would say rightfully so, because it certainly sounds like God offered mercy and withheld. The author then seems to be indicating that if God has the right to judge, God also has the right to give mercy, to be merciful, and God is. And David acknowledges and very, very fully and forcefully says, "Hey, I'm the one that did wrong. Leave the people alone. Leave the people alone." A thing that a good king, a king who feared Yahweh should say, right? "Let your hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house." He's claiming it all for himself. That day, Gad came to David and said to him, "Go up and erect an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." Following Gad's instructions, David went up as Yahweh had commanded. When Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming toward him, and Araunah went out and prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to Yahweh, so that the plague may be averted from the people." Then Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen and the burnt offering and the threshing sledges and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king." And Araunah said to the king, "May Yahweh your God respond favorably to you." Pause. Now, in First Chronicles, it doesn't say it here, but in First Chronicles, it says that the angel stood nearby with the sword drawn. Apparently the author of that story was that version of the story was trying to say that influenced Araunah's magnanimity, and that, how gracious and generous he was, because he does give a very generous offer to David. Oh, you can have whatever you need. Take the threshing floor, take these oxen, take the oxen, everything you need, you can have. I'm just going to give it to you. And may Yahweh, your God, respond favorably to you. So, because David is going up now for worship, it would seem that the repentance that David has had and this plea that David has made are good, but to fully demonstrate David's belief and trust in God, and to fully demonstrate everything, worship seems to be needed, and a sacrifice needs to be offered. So David goes up to go through all this. Araunah makes that statement, picking up from there. But the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will buy them from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to Yahweh my God that cost me nothing." Worship of God and the sacrifice, there needs to be that personal cost, we might say. Personal cost. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. David built there an altar to Yahweh, and offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. So Yahweh answered his supplication for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. End of 2 Samuel. Now, so David's worship and sacrifice were legitimate and approved, accepted, and all things good. We might say. Now, that's all that it says in 2 Samuel. When you read the similar story in 1 Chronicles, the ending changes a little bit. It seems that this story, and in particular this threshing floor of Araunah, and the fact that David had built an altar there, it seems that in over the years after that, through the exile in particular, we might say that there came to be a connection between this place and the construction of the temple. And I'm pretty sure they are the same location. I think we're told that in 1 Kings. But to heighten that connection, the first chronicler adds to the story and says that that David declared right then and there that this is where the temple will be built, and immediately began to store up stuff, to store up goods that would be used in the construction of the temple under his son Solomon. But that's only in the story of of Chronicles, not here in the story, the version told in Samuel. All right, my friends, that's it for today. I do pray again that this has been beneficial to you, that you've learned something, relearned something. I'm so humbled that so many of you come back again and again, day after day, to join me, to join together in this. It's very humbling, very humbling. I thank you for your understanding in taking a couple weeks off from this. I know anytime there's a kind of a change, it might upset our lives and our patterns and things like that. I appreciate that. I certainly understand that. But hopefully, when we return on the 19th of September, you'll be able to return with me. I know sometimes when we take a break, it's hard to get back into a habit, of anything, but I need to do this anyway. All right, my friends, thank you. I do pray that keep your eyes and ears open, physical and spiritual, to everything that our living, loving, active God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. When you see it, when you hear it, say, "Thank you, Papa," and then tell somebody about it. Until we meet again, my friends, be blessed.